Kings and Generals' medieval presence. What everyone gets wrong about feudalism. Feudalism is a word we all recognize, even if we can't all define it. But what does it actually mean? And how did we come to understand it the way that we do today? It's me. Let's talk about feud. Before the 1990s, the prevailing view among historians was that feudalism was the dominant system which defined the Middle Ages. Some scholars even argued that it was a necessary evil to keep order in Europe during those chaotic times. Since then, however, our understanding of the term has changed dramatically. Today, most historians reject the notion that feudalism was ever widespread or a self-sustaining economic system. In fact, some go so far as to claim that it never really existed at all. So what's going on here? When historians talk about feudalism, they are referring to a complex web of institutions and relationships that characterized medieval European society. At the center of this web was the relationship between a lord and his vassal. In exchange for military service and loyalty, a vassal would receive a grant of land known as a fee, which they could keep as long as they continued to perform their obligations. This arrangement allowed for the distribution of power and wealth across a wide range of people, which made it possible for relatively small kingdoms to govern over large populations. But how and why this system developed is where things get complicated. Historians have long debated the origins of feudalism, with some arguing that it arose organically out of the needs of medieval society, while others contend that it was imposed by the ruling class as a way to maintain control. More recently, scholars have begun to question whether feudalism can even be considered a system at all. Instead, it may be more accurate to think of it as a set of relationships and practices that developed in response to specific challenges facing medieval rulers. One such challenge was the changing nature of warfare in medieval Europe. During the early Middle Ages, the Frankish army, one of the most powerful militaries in Western Europe, was largely composed of peasant foot soldiers who fought in mass formations, wielding spears and shields to great effect. These men were not professional soldiers, but rather farmers who took up arms when called upon by their lord. However, as the century wore on, warfare in Europe became more fluid and less predictable. Battles were no longer decided by the size of the armies or the strength of their infantry, but rather by the speed and maneuverability of mounted horsemen armed with bows and arrows. This change was driven in part by technological advances in weaponry, as well as changes in tactics and strategy. For example, the introduction of new weapons like the longbow and the crossbow allowed for greater accuracy and lethality from a distance. Meanwhile, new military strategies emphasized the importance of mobility and flexibility on the battlefield. As a result, there was an increasing demand for professional soldiers who could wield these new weapons effectively and execute the more complex strategies. The Franks, along with other European kingdoms, began to rely more heavily on armored cavalrymen to protect their interests. Unlike the foot soldiers who came from the peasantry, these horsemen were typically higher on the social rungs, possessing the wealth and training necessary to equip themselves and maintain their horses. As a result, these men were less dependent on the state for employment and more willing to fight as mercenaries, selling their services to the highest bidder. Unfortunately for the Franks, this development had a significant impact on the composition of their army. By the late 8th century, only about 1/3 of Frankish soldiers were still infantry, whereas 2/3 were cavalrymen. To make matters worse, the cavalry outnumbered the infantry by 4-1 in some regions. Not only was this bad news for the Franks, but it was a harbinger of things to come. As the century progressed, the need for cavalrymen would only grow, leading to a gradual decline in the importance of infantry. The problem for the Franks and later European kingdoms was that these cavalrymen were expensive. Not only did they require significant investment in terms of equipment and training, but maintaining a warhorse was also costly. A single horse could consume as much grain in a day as 8 men. So how did medieval monarchs manage to afford all of this? One way was through taxation. Peasants were generally exempt from paying taxes, but the wealthier members of society had to contribute their fair share. Another method was through confiscation. Many monarchs seized church lands and redistributed them among their followers as rewards for their service. And finally, there was the practice of granting fiefdoms, which was a clever way to avoid paying your debts. Now, before we continue, let me just say that this is a highly simplified explanation of a very complex topic. But for our purposes, the important thing to remember is that feudalism was not a static system. It evolved over time in response to changing circumstances, and one of those circumstances was debt. In medieval Europe, owing money was a serious problem. Not only did it carry a heavy social stigma, but it could also lead to the seizure of one's property and even enslavement. As a result, people who owed money often went to great lengths to avoid repaying their debts. One common way to avoid paying back money was to simply run away and start a new life elsewhere. However, this was not always easy to do, especially if you were a member of the nobility. See, in medieval Europe, the nobility were generally expected to stay on their land and defend it against invaders. So, if you were a nobleman who owed a lot of money, running away was not really an option. Another way to avoid paying back a debt was to ask for an extension. This was often seen as a sign of weakness and could damage one's reputation. Plus, there was no guarantee that the creditor would agree to an extension. Which brings us to the third option, becoming a vassal. When a nobleman became a vassal of a more powerful lord, they were essentially agreeing to give up some of their autonomy in exchange for protection. In theory, this arrangement was mutually beneficial. The vassal received protection from the dangers of medieval life, and the lord gained an additional source of revenue. However, in practice, the relationship between a lord and his vassal was often fraught with tension. Vassals were constantly trying to find ways to maximize their independence and autonomy, while still receiving the benefits of being a vassal, and one of the ways they accomplished this was through precarium loans. A precarium loan was a type of debt that was paid back with land rather than money. In other words, instead of giving a sum of money to a creditor, a borrower would give them a piece of their land. Then, once the loan was repaid, the land would be returned. But this was easier said than done. For example, what if the borrower died before they could repay the loan? In this case, the lender would typically take possession of the land and either keep it or sell it to someone else. Or what if the borrower defaulted on the loan? In this case, the lender would have the right to seize the land and keep it. As you can see, precarium loans were risky for both parties involved. But for the borrower, the consequences of defaulting were especially dire. If they lost their land, they would lose their source of income and their ability to support themselves and their family. They would also lose their status and power in society, and their reputation would be ruined. That's why precarium loans were often used as a last resort, but for some borrowers, it was the only option they had. For example, imagine you are a Frankish knight who owes 3,000 pounds of silver to various creditors. You have tried to negotiate lower payments, but they refuse. You can't pay off your debt all at once, so you're forced to turn to precarium loans. You approach your king and ask for permission to mortgage your land to one of your nobles in order to repay your debts. The king agrees and grants your noble a precarium loan for the amount of land you have pledged. Now your noble owns your land until you repay the loan. At first, this arrangement works out well for everyone involved. You are able to repay your debts and keep your land. Your creditors are happy to have received their money, and the king is pleased that his vassal remains solvent. However, after a few years, your luck runs out. You find yourself in debt once again, and you turn to precarium loans to save you. But this time things don't work out so well. You are forced to mortgage even more of your land, and eventually your entire estate. Now your noble has taken possession of your land and is collecting the rents. You have become a tenant on your own land, and your status and power in society have been greatly diminished. As this example illustrates, precarium loans were a risky proposition. For the borrower, there was always the possibility that they would lose their land and their status, and that's exactly what happened in many cases. The practice of precarium loans played a significant role in the development of feudalism because it created a situation where a large number of nobles were economically dependent on the king. To make matters worse, the revenue generated by these precarium loans was often unreliable and difficult to collect, which meant that the king had to find other ways to fund his expenses. In some cases, they turned to the church for financial assistance. In others, they relied on the wealth of the peasantry. Whatever methods they used, the fact remained that medieval kings were constantly short on money, and they needed to find new and innovative ways to make up the difference. If you liked this video, then check out my series on the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. My channel is supported by a community of patrons who get access to a number of perks, including a monthly podcast, blooper reels, and the power to request topics for future videos. If you want to learn more about the medieval world, then look no further. And as always, thank you for watching.